Welcome, students. Today we're going to go over the chapter of radiations and extinctions. Really, this chapter is much more than just that. The objectives, actually, of this chapter are understanding how the continents are formed from a supercontinent, the supercontinent Pangaea, which you guys, I'm sure, have heard about in high school already. Then we're going to talk about biogeography a little bit, how we then, considering Pangaea, can understand what is the history of distribution of species on Earth. Then we're going to talk about major mass extinction events that have happened on Earth. Then we're going to talk about the concept of background extinctions and what it is. This is something you have to know. And the new die-offs, especially due to human activity. And finally, we're going to talk about cradles of diversity, which you will know what they are at the end. All right, so let's start with Pangaea and the formation of continents. Pangaea was a supercontinent that was present on Earth about 300 million years ago. And it began to break apart about 200 million years ago. And there was a gradual movement, of course. We think that there was a separation between a northern and a southern continents. The northern was known as Laurasia, and the southern is known as Gondwanland. And this is the situation that was present about 200 million years ago when it started to actually break apart. Then, over the course of millions of years, again, gradual movements from around 150 million years ago, we could already recognize this situation that you see here. And then about 65 million years ago, I'll say 65 million years ago is a date that we're going to recall pretty soon here. This coincides with the extinction of big reptiles, dinosaurs. So we are pretty much already pretty separated at that point. And present day, we have this situation where we can recognize all the different continents. So we have a lot of evidence of the existence of Pangaea. And this is not only evidence that regards organisms, but also geological evidence. So there is a strong fossil evidence of the existence of Pangaea. In fact, otherwise you couldn't explain how fossil of extinct creatures are found, identical fossils of same species across continents that are nowadays separated by ocean. And this is a very famous diagram that shows you how fossils, of course, plants and animals as well, many different species, identical species, have been found in separated continents. And really, you can put the continents back together as pieces of a puzzle, just following this fossil distribution. So there is a strong biological evidence, if you will, of the existence of Pangaea. But there is also a lot of geological evidence. For instance, geological trends have been studied, and geological trends refer to, for instance, glacier deposits, especially till, which is actually what's left behind after a glacier resides in if you look at the composition of this till over this area where all the continents were coming together, it's the same, and different continents and now are separated. So they were in fact united at the time or formation of this till. Other geological evidence is, for instance, paleomagnetism, so which studies the orientation of magnetic minerals in rocks. Again, gives a strong suggestion of existence of Pangaea. And ultimately, the continuity of mountain chains provides a lot of evidence for Pangaea. One example is the Appalachian Mountains that actually extends from northeastern US to Ireland, Britain, Greenland, and Scandinavia. So this is very, very strong evidence. It's the same exact rock formation, mountain formation that nowadays is separated, but of course it was the same united formation at the time of existence of Pangaea. All right, so we know that we have a lot of evidence of the existence of Pangaea, and taking from that, when we study biogeography, so the distribution of species on Earth, we have to keep in mind that existence of Pangaea in order to come up with explanations and how and the history of a group of organisms. And one group that I want to mention about is marsupial. You know that marsupials, most modern marsupials, can be found mostly in Australia and surrounding islands, and a few just here and there. There is also one group in still in America, but really they're concentrated in Australia. In reality, marsupials did not originate at all in Australia. They ended up there. In fact, taking from fossil evidence, of course, we can trace the oldest marsupial fossil to 150 million years ago, and it's been found in China. So really marsupials originated in Asia, and then they start their migration out of Asia and gradually spread out all over and arrived also in Australia. Now you have to understand that we're talking about 150 million years ago, where the continents were still connected. There was some separation, but they were still connected. And of course, this allowed the spread out of this group. All right, so in events of extinction events, which we'll talk about here in a minute, in this series of mass extinction events, most of marsupials actually disappeared, and especially in the northern hemisphere. And but there was another group of marsupials in the northern hemisphere that started migrating south about 17 million years ago, and this is the group that pretty much survived. So the group expanded from South America into Antarctica and Australia, and of course these continents were attached at that time to South America. So about just recently, if you will, in geological time scale, about 55 million years ago, marsupials arrived to Australia. All right, so this is what we think that how the migration happened. And here with the axis, you see how marsupials that were present in the northern hemisphere all died out pretty much in mass extinction events. And finally, they ended up in Australia as well as in South America. But at some point, of course, South America, Australia, and Antarctica drifted apart, and so they got separated. And what happened is that about 3 million years ago, there was a group present in South America that migrated back to North America. and because there was a reconnection actually of South America and North America, and basically at that time there were still lots of species of marsupial in South America. And for instance, the cat-like saber-tooth marsupial that you must recognize from some movies here. And eventually, all died out in South America. And the species the only species that survived in North America and is still present nowadays is the Virginia opossum, shown here. Okay, and of course, all the species that migrated, the group that migrated to Australia, they diversified in many other species. They recognize that we recognize nowadays, excuse me, in Australia, were somehow made it through the mass extinction events, and that's why we find most of the marsupials there in Australia and surrounding areas nowadays. All right, so again, we talked about biogeography, and when we talk about biogeography, we cannot skip the concept of Pangea. Now, we're going to talk about the major mass extinction events that have happened on Earth. Now, just to give you a reminder, actually, we know that we have identified nowadays on Earth living species about between 1.5 and 1.8 million of species are recognized nowadays on Earth. And if you think about the history of life on Earth has been going on for about 3.5 billion years, you should remember this number. We talked about it for a long time. In all the species that have been on Earth and have gone extinct, we know that about 99% of the species that have ever existed on Earth are in fact extinct. So we are like a 1% of the species that ever existed on Earth are still alive and living. And so this gives you a little bit of a understanding of the magnitude of the number of species that have existed on Earth. And remember that the fact that we have identified 1.5 to 1.8 million living species on Earth doesn't mean this is the only number. In fact, we estimate that there are about close to 9 million living species on Earth. So we have not identified most of the living species on Earth, bottom line. All right, so just to give you a summary of what's going on in terms of species and number of species. Now, how did we lose lots of these species on Earth? All the huge number of species, how did they die? Well, some part of the cause of the extinction are mass extinction events. And here there is a time scale from the Cambrian. Remember, Cambrian is when there was an explosion of life on Earth and when all the species, all the groups, the phyla that we have talked about in Unit 2 evolved. Basically, you know that pre-Cambrian, before Cambrian, life was very boring, almost just unicellular. Then multicellularity happened in a Cambrian period, about 540 million years ago. That's when really a lot of complexity appeared. We talked about this. We talked about the explanation of Cambrian explosion. So really, starting from Cambrian, we can trace all the periods, subsequent periods, and understand what has happened in terms of life and number of species on Earth. So all these arrows over here represent big mass extinction events. And so we can count them. How many arrows are here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And there is one arrow that is bigger than the others, and it corresponds to a much deeper indentation. So these indentations represent a big decline in number of species, okay? And so they are put in evidence by the presence of these arrows. Now you see the biggest indentation and the biggest arrow is right here, kind of in the middle between Cambrian explosion and now, okay? And this is the Permian. The period where it happened is the Permian period, okay? So what I'm asking you to remember here is that there were 5 big mass extinction events, and I do want you to remember the biggest one, which is known as the Great Die. And then we're going to talk about also this one. This one is important for us because it tells you that after this big mass, it was quite significant extinction event, there is the age of mammals, and we are mammals, so that's why we're going to talk about this one a little bit more in detail. Okay, so 5 big mass extinction events. One was major. We were close to wipe off life on Earth here, but it didn't happen. Thankfully, it continued. Now, the other thing I want you to focus on from this graph is that after an indentation, there is a raise. There is, the curve goes up quite rapidly. So after, what does this mean? After a mass extinction event, you have a rapid explosion of species again. So from Cambrian, where you had a great explosion, first mass extinction event, explosion. Second mass extinction event, explosion. Third mass extinction event, huge increase of number of species. So that's why when we talk about mass extinctions, we talk about mass extinctions and radiations. Hopefully you recall we have introduced this term, radiation. The term radiation evolution does not mean what it means in physics whatsoever. A radiation is an explosion of species. So this tells you that after a big mass extinction event, there is always an explosion of species, always a radiation, okay? So that's a trend, and that's a fact, okay, that we observe. All right, so to give you a better understanding here of the 5 and the names also of the 5 biggest disaster in history, in life, the history of life on Earth, I want you to remember the Permian, okay? I'm not going to ask you about the names of the others. I'm going to ask you to remember the Permian, where about 95% of life on Earth was wiped off. So you can understand how we were really close. Now, in terms of the reason why these mass extinction events happen, it's very simple. Big catastrophes, big changes in conditions on Earth. And for instance, the Permian explosion, we think that the volcanic activity increased quite a bit all over the planet for some reason, and this of course released lots of toxic gases. Oxygen was removed from oceans, and you had a lot of desertification, and life was pretty much almost wiped off, okay? But nonetheless, after the end of this period of time of very harsh conditions, when the conditions restored, a favorable condition restored, we observe a radiation going on again. Okay, so other examples of reasons of mass extinctions could be, for instance, for Ordovician, this one, which was also a big one. This was a big event of cooling, rapid global cooling, and pretty much the Earth went frozen, okay? Now, so I'm asking you to remember Permian, the biggest mass extinction event, is also known as the Great Die. But there is another one that is interesting and important to remember for us, is the one that happened about, the last one basically, that happened about 65 million years ago, where we think that a big meteorite actually hit Earth. And this also it created a lot of climatic changes because of fires, widespread fires. There was actually so-called the nuclear winter. There was a lot of dust raised. So imagine not only after this impact, there were lots of conditions all over the planet that changed. And at this time on Earth, there were big reptiles that were dominating, the famous dinosaurs that we have fossil record of. And these big reptiles couldn't cope with these conditions. They couldn't hide anywhere. They were too big. So keep this in mind, okay? And this happened about 65 million years ago. So I am asking you to remember this number for me, 65 million years ago. This is very important for us. This mass extinction event is the reason why mammals could finally thrive, and we are mammals, okay? And so that's very much related to our existence. Now the Permian, remember the Permian extinction happened halfway through between the beginning of complex life, which happened about 500, precisely 540 million years ago, which is the Cambrian explosion, and now, so it shouldn't be that hard to kind of remember. It's halfway through the beginning of complex life, which is Cambrian, and now, okay, it's about 250 million years ago. All right, so these are the two mass extinction events that I want you to remember precisely about, and you have to remember for me that there have been 5 total that we can recognize. All right, so remember, this is just another graphical representation of the eras, geological eras and periods that I have shown you several times, okay? And so remember that we are around here when complex life appeared, Cambrian, okay, about 540 million years ago. And so we have talked about the Permian extinction event, the Great Die, and the Cretaceous extinction, which is extinction of big dinosaurs, about 65 million years ago. Okay, this is just a different representation for you. Just a reminder, when we talked about the different phyla, I did mention this already, the fact that the mammals underwent irradiation all of a sudden after the disappearance of dinosaurs. It's the result of this mass extinction event. And remember, mammals appeared about 200 million years ago on Earth, but they didn't they initially were very small nocturnal animals, hiding from the big predators. And when the big predators were wiped out by this catastrophic event that happened 65 million years ago, now you finally have the opportunity for mammals to come to the surface and start thriving and start diversifying, start radiating. Okay, so that's what happened. All right, so so I already told you that we estimate that about 99% of species that ever existed on Earth have gone extinct. Now, I don't want you to make the mistake to think that most of these species disappeared because of mass extinction event. Yes, a portion of them did disappear. They went extinct because of mass extinction events. But in reality, most of these extinctions are due to the so-called background extinction rate. So basically, about only 20% of all extinctions result from mass extinction events. 80% excuse me, of all extinctions actually are due to background extinctions. What are background extinctions? There is a normal extinction rate, okay? Species simply go extinct because not all life can be sustained on Earth. And some species that are, of course, better respond better to environmental changes, and they can better utilize the resources will go on. And unfortunately, some species will die out. So 80% of all the extinctions that we have observed and we estimate that have happened on Earth are due to background extinctions, not to mass extinctions, okay? Only 20% of all extinctions are due to mass extinctions, all right? So this is a concept that you must remember for me, all right? Just to give you an idea here, so if you have species that occupy a large geographical area, these species are less susceptible to go extinct than species that occupy a very narrow geographical area. You can understand this is logical to understand because, of course, if you occupy a very small geographical area and a disaster happens, for instance, you can imagine a volcanic eruption or the invasion by a predator, then the species that occupies a very narrow geographical area can go extinct very easily. Okay, so that's what generally happens. All right, so now lots of studies have been done on species and to understand how species go extinct. And we have observed many extinctions over the past few centuries. And so people were able to study how these species can go extinct. Now, unfortunately, since the civilization of Homo sapiens, there have been lots of species, lots of groups of animals and plants that have gone to extinction, have been driven to extinction. And because of the activity, direct or indirect activity of civilized Homo sapiens. For instance, Dutch explorers arrived in Mauritius Islands in the 1600s, and they literally killed out dodos, which are these giant birds, and for several reasons. First of all, with their ships, they introduced rats and in the Mauritius, and rats were eating dodos' eggs, and of course they were hitting reproduction. But also the adults and the young were killed because of the direct use of these big birds by humans. So this was just like very quick. It happened in about 100 years. In 100 years, humans brought these giant birds to extinction. All right. And so killing directly like this a species is not the only reason why a species can go extinct. You can indirectly cause extinction of a species by depriving the species of its habitat or introducing predators that were not present there before, so non-native species, okay, or in general by human activities, for instance, building a city where there was an environment for several species to live there before. All right, so there are many examples we can give of species that have gone extinct in the past a few hundred years for human activity. Carolina parakeet is a very famous one. They were very abundant in southeastern United States, and because of the logging industry and the activity, cutting trees, they lost their habitat basically, and they went extinct, okay, in the 1900s. So this is a very striking example. In the Pacific, it is currently estimated that 2,000 bird species have gone extinct since the arrival of humans. We have so many more examples. And again, why all these new die-offs? It's because of activity like deforestation, cutting down trees. It deprives especially birds of their environment, as simple as that. So according to the current estimate, up to 140,000 species per year may be the current rate of extinction. 140,000 species per year, most of them because of human activity. Okay. Some other examples, there are many, many more. These are just examples, but giant birds were actually have gone mostly extinct because the domestication by humans and the use of them for one reason or another. And so we have lots of examples of giant birds that have gone extinct in the past few hundred years. We have also in the island of Madagascar, which is really a paradise of diversity. There's a lot of extinction that has been going on there, and especially for giant birds, but many other species, including, for instance, lemurs, which are very close relative of ours, as we will learn in one of the next lectures. Okay. So about 70 species of lemur, which is a lot. Really, there aren't very many. But okay, so again, other species, especially birds, have been highly impacted by human activity. Okay, and so just to give you an idea of how important it is to preserve species on Earth, this could impact directly our lives, because remember that, for instance, when we talk about active ingredients of medications that we use, they're very helpful for human health. Remember that most of the active ingredients have been discovered and been extracted initially from plants. So now, nowadays, the artificial molecule may be, they figure out how to make the artificial molecule in the lab, but they make it upon knowing the molecule that has been extracted from plants initially. So we give examples of extinctions of animals, but there is a lot of course, we have given to extinction lots of plants as well because of deforestation, direct killing them, directly really eradicating them. And so these extinctions, the new extinction rates that we have created could have direct impact, negative impact even on our health. All right, so the last concept we're going to talk about in this presentation is the concept of cradles of diversity. And I think I'm going to stop here and create a part 2, otherwise it becomes too long. There are a couple of videos I want to show you also in the second part of this presentation. Okay, so I'll see you in part 2. Thank you.